Welcome back. If you are here right now, pause for a moment. Not just physically, but internally. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders relax. Let the noise of the day fade into the background, because what you are about to hear is not meant to compete with distractions. It is meant to meet you. This is not something you stumbled upon. This is not just another video filling empty space. Something deeper drew you here. Something beneath logic, beneath habit, beneath routine. Not coincidence, not chance, alignment. There are moments when life seems to pause on its own, when the pace slows not because you decided to rest, but because something unseen reaches for your attention. This is one of those moments. Something is happening inside you, and it has been happening for longer than you may realize. The restlessness you have felt lately is not anxiety. It is not dissatisfaction without cause. It is recognition. Your spirit responding to truth before your mind has fully caught up. Your soul remembers something your conscious thinking has tried to forget. That subtle pull you feel, the quiet sense that something is shifting, the feeling that ordinary life suddenly feels hollow or incomplete, that is not a problem to fix. It is a signal. Awakening does not announce itself loudly. It begins as tension, as unease, as a sense that what once fit no longer does. You may have noticed it creeping in slowly. A loss of interest in things that once distracted you. A deeper sensitivity to silence. A discomfort with surface-level conversations. A sense that time is moving differently, like something important is approaching but not yet visible. These are not random experiences. They are symptoms of remembrance, because something ancient inside you is stirring. You were never designed to live unaware. You were never meant to experience life only through routine, repetition, and surface meaning. Long before you learned language, before belief systems shaped your thinking, before the world told you who you were supposed to be, there was already something within you that carried depth. Awareness that did not come from education, culture, or environment. It came from origin. Scripture says you were known before you were formed. But knowing is not passive. It is intentional. It is deliberate. It means your existence was not an experiment. It was an assignment. Your life did not begin the moment you were born. Birth was simply the moment your spirit became visible in this world. And from early on, you sensed that something about you was different. Not in a way that made you better than others. Not in a way that gave you language or certainty. Just different. You noticed patterns others overlooked. You felt emotional undercurrents others ignored. You asked questions that made people uncomfortable. You often felt like an observer rather than a participant, like you were watching life from a slightly different angle. That sense of being out of place was never because you were broken. It was because your spirit was not shaped by the same blueprint as the world around you. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't ego. That wasn't you trying to be special. That was memory. Your spirit recognized truth long before your mind knew how to explain it. Like a seed buried deep beneath the soil, that awareness remained hidden. Not dead, not lost, dormant, waiting for the right conditions to activate it. Because seeds do not grow in visibility. They grow in darkness, in pressure, in stillness, in time. And silence has played a significant role in your life. There were seasons when you felt overlooked, misunderstood, or invisible. Times when your depth felt like a liability instead of a gift. Moments when you learned, consciously or unconsciously, to soften yourself just to belong, to quiet your insight, to downplay your intensity, to simplify your thoughts so others would feel comfortable around you. You learned how to adapt, how to shrink, how to translate yourself into something easier to digest. But no matter how well you learned the rules, something inside you resisted. That resistance was not defiance. It was not rebellion. It was truth. Your spirit refused to be compressed into a version of life that could not contain it. Many people misinterpret that inner discomfort. They call it restlessness. They call it dissatisfaction. They assume something is wrong with them. But what you were experiencing was misalignment. You were living beneath your design, and your soul knew it even when your logic tried to override it. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from pretending to be smaller than you are. A quiet suffocation that builds when you deny your own depth. The more you tried to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you, the louder your inner world became. Until eventually, something had to shift. That moment, when pretending becomes unbearable, is where awakening begins. Your difference is not a flaw. It is a signal, a compass, evidence that you carry something sacred, something rare, something necessary. The world does not always know how to receive what is uncommon, but that does not reduce its value. This is why labels never fully stuck to you. Why categories felt limiting. Why no single identity ever explained you completely. You were not designed from the world's template. You operate from a design authored beyond it. And that design comes with an assignment. This is also why your life has carried unusual resistance. The intensity of what you faced was never proportional to who you appeared to be on the surface. It was proportional to who you actually are beneath it. Darkness does not invest energy into what is insignificant. The opposition you encountered was not proof of weakness. It was evidence of value. You were not targeted because you lacked strength. You were targeted because your presence disrupted unconscious systems, because awareness threatens control, because light exposes what prefers to stay hidden. You may have noticed how certain environments feel different when you enter, how conversations subtly shift, how people react strongly to you without clear reason, sometimes with attraction, sometimes with discomfort, sometimes with projection. That is not personality, that is frequency. You carry spiritual weight. An atmosphere responds to you. Light does not need to announce itself to be felt. And when light enters a space, everything unaligned becomes visible. Some people interpreted your discernment as judgment, your depth as intensity, your self-awareness as arrogance. But they were not seeing you clearly. They were reacting to what your presence revealed within them. Rejection was never a reflection of your worth. It was confirmation of your altitude. And that rejection often led to isolation. Not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as protection. What is still forming needs covering. What is still fragile needs space. Seeds are hidden before they are revealed, and you were kept in quiet seasons because premature exposure could have damaged what was still developing. Those lonely years were not empty. They were instructional. God was shaping your character, refining your discernment, strengthening your inner foundation, working on you before working through you. And now, something is changing. If you have felt a growing dissatisfaction with old habits, old environments, Old conversations, that is not ingratitude. That is expansion. Awakening makes what once entertained you feel hollow. What once comforted you feel confining. You are not confused. You are growing. Your spirit is outgrowing structures built for a past version of you. And growth always demands space. This is where many people feel fear, because transition feels like loss before it feels like alignment. Things begin to fall away. Relationships shift. Doors close without explanation. But what feels like subtraction is actually preparation. Nothing is being removed without purpose. You are not losing what matters. You are making room for what aligns. And this is only the beginning. As this awakening continues to unfold, one of the first things you begin to understand is why your path has always felt narrower than others. Why connection came easily for people around you, yet for you, relationships often felt complicated, temporary, or misaligned. Why you could be surrounded by people and still feel alone. This was never because you were difficult to love. It was because your spirit required a different environment to grow. Isolation was not an accident in your life. It was a design. From the outside, it may have looked like exclusion, abandonment, or bad timing. But from a higher perspective, it was containment. You were separated not because you were unworthy of connection, but because the wrong connections could dilute what was being formed inside you. Not everyone has the capacity to sit with depth. Not everyone can walk beside someone who carries awareness without feeling threatened by it. You noticed early on that certain relationships felt draining, even when nothing was overtly wrong. Conversations stayed surface level. Emotional exchanges felt transactional. You found yourself giving more than receiving, explaining more than being understood. Over time, your spirit learned that constant translation is exhausting, and so withdrawal became a form of self-preservation. This is where many people misunderstand you. They saw your distance and called it coldness. They mistook your discernment for judgment. They interpreted your boundaries as rejection. But what they could not see was the internal pressure you were under. The way your spirit was being shaped required solitude, required stillness, required space free from noise and influence. Growth at this level cannot happen in crowded rooms. You were not meant to be shaped by consensus or comfort. You were meant to develop clarity, and clarity often comes through separation. When you are removed from constant input, your inner voice becomes louder. When distractions fade, truth becomes clearer. This is why your isolation often coincided with intense inner development. While others were distracted by movement, you were being trained in awareness. While others were building external identities, you were dismantling internal illusions. While others were chasing validation, you were learning how to exist without it. These seasons were not easy. There were moments when loneliness felt heavy, when silence echoed too loudly, when you questioned whether something was wrong with you for needing space others did not. When you wondered why connection felt elusive, even when you desired it. But underneath the discomfort, something was happening. Your discernment was sharpening. You began to notice patterns more clearly. You sensed intentions before words confirmed them. You could feel when something was misaligned, even if it looked perfect on the surface. This sensitivity was not weakness. It was training. Your nervous system was learning to recognize truth without explanation. And with that sensitivity came pressure. Spiritual pressure often manifests as emotional intensity. You may have experienced heightened empathy, deeper emotional waves, sudden fatigue, or periods of withdrawal where your body demanded rest, even when nothing seemed physically wrong. This was not instability. It was recalibration. Your system was adjusting to carry more awareness. At the same time, resistance intensified. The more you grew internally, the more external friction appeared. Misunderstandings increased. People projected onto you. You became a mirror without trying to be. And mirrors often make people uncomfortable because they reveal what has been avoided. You noticed how some people felt drawn to you but couldn't stay close. How admiration sometimes turned into resentment. How your presence seemed to highlight unspoken insecurities in others. This was never your responsibility to manage. Light does not argue for its existence. It simply illuminates. And illumination disrupts comfort. This is why certain spaces began to feel hostile without explanation. Why you felt the need to leave environments that once felt safe. Why your body reacted before your logic did. Your intuition was protecting you before your mind could rationalize the danger. During this phase, you may have questioned yourself constantly. Wondered if you were overthinking. If you were too sensitive. If you should try harder to fit in. If you were imagining the tension. You weren't. Your awareness was simply ahead of your environment. But awareness without understanding can feel isolating. And so, doubt crept in. Not doubt about truth, but doubt about yourself. You may have internalized other people's discomfort. You may have tried to adjust your energy to make others comfortable. You may have silenced insights to maintain peace. Each time you did, something inside you pushed back. Because every compromise of your inner truth created friction in your spirit. This is where many people break or retreat permanently. But you didn't. Even when confused, even when tired, even when unsure, you continue to listen, to observe, to question, to seek. That persistence mattered, because what felt like constant resistance was actually refinement. Pressure reveals structure. It shows where you are solid and where you are still flexible. And you were being strengthened in ways that could not be taught through ease. You learned how to sit with yourself, how to endure silence without distraction, how to face your inner world honestly. You confronted fears that others avoided. You questioned beliefs that were handed to you without thought. You peeled back layers of identity that were never truly yours. This inner work was unseen by most people, but it changed everything. You became less reactive, less dependent on approval, less willing to betray your intuition for acceptance. You began to trust your internal signals, even when they conflicted with external opinions. That trust is the foundation of authority, and authority cannot be rushed. You also began to notice that your isolation was not constant. It came in waves. Periods of connection followed by withdrawal. Moments of clarity followed by quiet integration. This rhythm was intentional. Growth requires integration. Insight must be absorbed before it can be applied. God was not withholding connection. He was timing it. Because premature alignment can be as damaging as misalignment. You needed to know yourself before walking alongside others. You needed to recognize your own voice before navigating shared paths. Otherwise, you would have been shaped by louder energies instead of standing firmly in your own. This is why certain relationships ended suddenly. Why some connections faded without conflict. Why others felt intense but short-lived. They were never meant to be permanent. They were mirrors, lessons, catalysts. Their departure was not rejection. It was completion. And even though endings hurt, they created space. Space for clarity. Space for alignment. Space for what comes next. Now, as this season deepens, you may feel a strange combination of grief and anticipation. Mourning versions of yourself that no longer fit. Letting go of identities you worked hard to maintain. Releasing attachments that once felt essential. This is not loss. This is transition. You are not being stripped. You are being refined. And refinement always precedes expansion. The solitude that once felt heavy begins to feel purposeful. Silence becomes a place of strength instead of absence. You no longer fear being alone because you have met yourself there. And once you meet yourself, you are never truly alone again. This is the stage where preparation turns into positioning. You may not see visible results yet, but internally, alignment is happening. Your values are clearer. Your boundaries are firmer. Your intuition is sharper. Your sense of self is stabilizing. You are becoming harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to pull off course. And that is exactly what was needed before the next phase could begin. Because what comes next requires presence, requires discernment, requires the ability to recognize alignment when it appears, and it will appear sooner than you think. As this inner alignment stabilizes, something subtle but undeniable begins to change around you. Life starts responding differently. Situations that once felt stuck begin to loosen. Conversations open doors instead of closing them. You notice moments where things line up without force, without strategy, without the exhausting effort you once relied on. This isn't coincidence. It's alignment finally catching up with preparation. For a long time, it felt like you were pushing against resistance in every direction. No matter how sincere your intentions, how disciplined your effort, or how patient your waiting, progress came slowly. And now, almost without warning, momentum starts to build. Not chaotic movement, but intentional flow, the kind where you feel carried rather than strained. This is what happens when internal readiness meets divine timing. Acceleration doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up quietly at first, a message that arrives at the exact right moment, an opportunity that feels strangely effortless, a solution that appears just when pressure peaks. You might even question it at first, wondering why things suddenly feel easier, why doors are opening without struggle. That ease isn't laziness, it's permission. You spent years proving resilience, enduring delay, developing depth, learning discernment. Now the season shifts from survival to stewardship, from preparation to application. And with that shift comes visibility. Not spotlight visibility. Alignment visibility. People begin to notice you differently. Not because you changed your personality, but because you stopped hiding parts of yourself. Your clarity becomes noticeable. Your calm carries weight. Your words land deeper. You don't try to persuade, truth speaks through presence. This can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. You may feel the urge to downplay yourself again, to retreat into old patterns of minimizing. But this time, the impulse doesn't control you. Because something inside you knows, you didn't come this far to disappear again. This visibility is not about attention. It's about impact. Light that has matured can now be seen without burning others or itself. You are no longer reactive. You're regulated, grounded, aware, and awareness changes how you move through the world. You begin making decisions faster, not impulsively, but intuitively. Overthinking loses its grip because discernment replaces doubt. You don't need excessive validation anymore. You sense alignment internally before evidence appears externally. This is where confidence quietly replaces fear. Not confidence rooted in ego, but confidence rooted in clarity. You know what you're here to do, even if every detail isn't mapped yet. You recognize when something is for you and when it isn't, and you're no longer tempted to chase what doesn't resonate. Because chasing drains energy, alignment multiplies it. As this continues, you may notice changes in your relationships. Some people who once felt central begin to feel distant, not through conflict but through divergence. Conversations don't flow the same way. Shared interests fade. It's not hostility, it's trajectory. At the same time, new connections emerge with surprising ease. People who feel familiar without history. Conversations that go deep quickly. Mutual recognition without explanation. These aren't random encounters. They're synchronized. Alignment attracts alignment. These people don't need you to perform. They don't require shrinking or translation. You don't feel drained after interacting with them. You feel expanded, seen, energized. That's how you know. You're also likely experiencing changes in how you relate to time. Patience no longer feels passive. Waiting feels intentional. You sense when to move and when to pause. Urgency fades because trust deepens. You understand now that rushing never brought fulfillment, only exhaustion. And exhaustion was never your destiny. This is also the phase where provision begins to show up in precise ways. Not necessarily abundance all at once, but accuracy. Exactly what's needed when it's needed. Support arriving just before overwhelm. Resources aligning with responsibility. This teaches you something important. You were never meant to carry everything alone. Independence served a purpose in earlier seasons, but now collaboration becomes possible. Not dependency, interdependence. You allow support without guilt. You receive without feeling indebted. Because you understand now that flow requires exchange. Nothing stagnates when energy moves. You may also notice a deepening sense of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. Problems still exist, but they don't dominate your inner world. You don't spiral the way you used to. Emotional regulation improves. You respond instead of react. That emotional steadiness is a sign of maturity. Your nervous system is no longer stuck in survival mode. It recognizes safety. It trusts the process. It knows you're supported, even when outcomes aren't immediate. This internal calm allows creativity to resurface. Ideas begin flowing again. Vision expands. You think bigger, not out of ambition, but alignment. You sense potential not as fantasy, but as inevitability. And with vision comes responsibility. You start realizing that what you carry isn't just for you. Your insight, your steadiness, your awareness, it affects others. People gravitate towards you for clarity, not answers. For grounding, not solutions. You don't need to preach. Your presence teaches. This realization shifts how you move through the world. You become intentional with energy, protective of peace, discerning about access. You understand now that not everyone deserves proximity, and that discernment doesn't make you closed, it makes you wise. You also begin to reinterpret your past through a new lens. Experiences that once felt confusing start making sense. The timing of setbacks, the nature of losses, the intensity of growth, all of it aligns into a coherent narrative. Nothing was random, nothing was wasted. Each challenge refined something specific. Each delay protected something essential. Each closed door redirected you toward a better alignment. This clarity brings forgiveness, not just for others, but for yourself. You release shame for choices made without awareness. You stop judging earlier versions of yourself harshly. You see now that you did the best you could with the understanding you had. Compassion replaces criticism, and compassion expands capacity. As capacity expands, so does influence. Not influence measured by numbers or recognition, but by depth. People trust you. They listen. They feel safe opening up. You don't need to force authority. It's felt. This is the difference between power and presence. Power demands, presence invites. And you operate from presence now. You also notice that fear doesn't disappear, but it no longer controls you. Fear becomes information, not instruction. You acknowledge it, but you don't obey it. You move forward anyway, grounded in discernment. This is courage without chaos. At this stage, alignment becomes your default state. You no longer feel constantly pulled in conflicting directions. Decisions simplify. Values clarify. You know what drains you and what fuels you. And because of that clarity, momentum builds naturally. This is the season where action feels clean, where effort feels focused, where results feel proportional. You're no longer fighting invisible resistance, because most of it was internal, and that's been resolved. You're not pushing against life anymore. You're moving with it. And this movement prepares you for the final shift. Because awakening isn't just awareness, it's embodiment. You're not just realizing truth, you're living it. And once truth is embodied, it cannot be taken away. At a certain point in this journey, something locks into place. It's subtle, but it's permanent. You stop oscillating between confidence and doubt. You stop questioning whether you're allowed to take up space. You stop waiting for some external signal to validate what your spirit already knows. This is the moment identity stabilizes, not because life becomes easy, but because you become anchored. You no longer wake up wondering who you need to be today. You don't shift to fit environments. You don't scan rooms for approval. You move from an internal center that doesn't fracture under pressure. What once felt like uncertainty now feels like grounded awareness. This is embodiment. Truth isn't something you think about anymore. It's something you live inside of. Your values aren't theoretical. They show up in how you speak, how you choose, how you walk away, how you stay. Integrity becomes instinctive. Alignment becomes natural. You no longer argue with yourself internally. That inner conflict, the constant negotiation between who you are and who you thought you should be, finally quiets. And in that quiet, authority begins to rise. Authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It doesn't compete. It settles. You start noticing that when you speak, people listen differently. Not because your voice got louder, but because your words are weighted with presence. You don't over-explain anymore. You don't fill silence to ease discomfort. You allow pauses to exist because you're no longer afraid of them. Silence stops feeling like emptiness. It feels like command. You become comfortable being misunderstood, Because clarity inside no longer depends on agreement outside. That freedom changes everything. It removes the need to defend. It dissolves the urge to convince. It frees enormous amounts of energy that were once trapped in proving yourself. And that energy redirects into purpose. Purpose activation doesn't feel dramatic. It feels inevitable. Like stepping into something that's been waiting for you, not something you're forcing into existence. You recognize what you're meant to do not through sudden revelation, but through sustained resonance. It feels right. It feels aligned. It feels honest. You start saying no more easily, not out of fear, but discernment. You understand that every yes carries cost. And now you choose intentionally. You stop trading long-term alignment for short-term comfort. This is where leadership begins, even if you never seek the title. Leadership isn't about position. It's about orientation. People begin to orient themselves around your steadiness. They seek your perspective not because you have all the answers, but because you ask the right questions. Because you don't panic. Because you don't react impulsively. Your regulation becomes contagious. You hold space without absorbing chaos. You listen without losing yourself. You support without overextending. Boundaries strengthen, not as walls, but as structure. This is authority with compassion. You also begin to recognize the difference between effort and force. Earlier seasons required grit, endurance, pushing through resistance. Now, movement feels cleaner. When something requires constant forcing, you pause. You reassess. You ask whether alignment is present or whether you're trying to resurrect an outdated path. This saves you time. This protects your energy. This preserves your clarity. You stop romanticizing struggle. You understand now that hardship was a teacher, not a requirement. Growth doesn't need to hurt to be real. Expansion doesn't need to exhaust to be valid. You allow yourself to receive ease without guilt. That's a major shift. Because many people sabotage embodiment by believing ease means complacency. But ease, when earned through alignment, is simply flow. And flow is where effectiveness multiplies. Your intuition sharpens even further. You don't just sense danger, you sense timing. You know when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to move and when to wait, when to act and when to observe. Discernment becomes reflexive. You also notice changes in how you experience fear. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses authority. It becomes background noise instead of a command center. You feel it arise, and you keep moving anyway. That's courage integrated into identity. You don't see courage as something you summon, it's something you are. And because of this, your purpose begins to express itself more clearly. Not necessarily in one dramatic role, but through consistent contribution. You understand the lane you're meant to occupy. You stop comparing your path to others. You stop measuring success by visibility. You focus on impact. Impact looks different at this stage. It's quieter, deeper, more sustainable. You're no longer interested in impressing. You're interested in building something that lasts. You also realize that your story, every part of it, has become usable. Not performatively, authentically. You don't lead from theory, you lead from lived understanding, and that gives your words credibility no title ever could. People trust you because you don't pretend. You don't exaggerate your certainty. You don't minimize your experience. You speak from a place of grounded truth, and that resonates more than perfection ever could. This is where mentorship naturally emerges. Not formal teaching necessarily, but guidance through example. People mirror your calm. They model your boundaries. They adopt your perspective without you instructing them to. That's influence at its highest form. You're also more selective about where you invest yourself. You understand that not every opportunity is an assignment. Not every open door is yours to walk through. And that discernment keeps your purpose focused instead of diluted. Clarity protects calling. As your identity stabilizes, you become less reactive to external chaos. News, opinions, trends, none of it destabilizes you the way it once did. You stay informed without becoming inflamed. You care without collapsing. This emotional maturity allows you to stay present even in conflict. You don't avoid hard conversations, but you don't escalate them either. You address truth without aggression. You correct without humiliation. You hold others accountable without losing compassion. That balance is rare, and rare things carry weight. You also start trusting yourself more deeply. You no longer second-guess every decision. You accept that not every choice will be perfect, but you trust your ability to adapt, to course correct, to learn. Self-trust replaces self-doubt. That shift alone changes how you move through life. You take calculated risks. You step forward without needing guarantees. You allow yourself to grow publicly instead of hiding until you feel ready. Because readiness is no longer something you wait for. It's something you practice. You understand now that identity doesn't form in isolation. It solidifies in motion, and motion requires courage. As purpose activates more fully, you feel a sense of responsibility, not pressure, but stewardship. You understand that what you carry affects others. Your choices ripple outward. Your alignment creates space for others to find theirs. That awareness humbles you. It grounds you. It keeps you honest. You don't chase platforms, you build foundations. You don't rush growth, you sustain it. You don't burn bright and fast, you burn steady. This is longevity. And longevity is what allows purpose to outlive seasons. You also become less attached to outcomes. Not indifferent, but detached from needing things to unfold a specific way. You do your part. You show up fully, and then you release control. Trust deepens here. Not blind trust, but experienced trust. Trust built from watching things work out in ways you couldn't have orchestrated. Trust built from seeing timing align after patience. Trust built from recognizing patterns of provision. This trust frees you from anxiety about the future. You plan responsibly, but you don't obsess. You prepare, but you don't panic. You move forward with confidence that you're supported, guided, and resourced. And that confidence is felt by others. Your presence becomes stabilizing. People feel calmer around you, safer, more grounded. You don't fix their lives, but you remind them of their own capacity. That's purpose activated. Not rescuing, not controlling, but illuminating. You don't need to announce this season. You embody it, and embodiment is unmistakable. This is the stage where identity, authority, and purpose converge, not as concepts, but as lived reality. You don't feel like you're becoming someone else. You feel like you've finally arrived at yourself. And from here, everything you build carries that signature. At some point, you stop asking for signs. Not because you no longer believe, but because your life itself has become the confirmation. You look back, not with regret, not with bitterness, but with understanding. The confusion had purpose. The delays had intelligence. The isolation had intention. What once felt like abandonment now reads as preparation. This is where legacy quietly begins. Not legacy as fame, not legacy as applause, but legacy as imprint. You realize that what you carry is meant to outlive moments, that the way you show up, the way you speak truth, the way you model integrity, these things ripple far beyond what you can measure. Your presence becomes a reference point for others, even when you're unaware of it. You understand now that impact doesn't require visibility. Some of the deepest influence happens privately. In conversations no one records. In choices no one sees. In restraint, in patience, in consistency. You stop needing your impact to be acknowledged to know it's real. That's maturity. That's spiritual grounding. You begin to sense a deeper alignment with timing. You no longer rush endings or cling to beginnings. You trust seasons. You respect transitions. You honor closure. You let things complete without dragging them into the future out of fear. You've learned that holding on too long can be just as misaligned as letting go too early. There's a calmness in this stage that feels earned, not passive, but peaceful. You still have vision, you still have drive, but it's no longer fueled by proving, escaping, or compensating. It's fueled by stewardship. You feel responsible, not pressured, to live in a way that honors what you've been entrusted with. Your gifts, your insight, your resilience. You no longer waste them on places that can't receive them. You protect them. You cultivate them. And because of that, they multiply. You notice that life begins meeting you with confirmation instead of resistance. Not because challenges disappear, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. Doors open where alignment exists. Paths clear where timing is right. And when something doesn't move, you don't force it. You listen. Discernment is now louder than desire. You also begin to see your past differently. The people who misunderstood you, the places that rejected you, the seasons that stripped you. You no longer internalize those experiences as indicators of your worth. You see them as filters. They removed what couldn't travel with you. They refined what needed strengthening. They clarified what mattered. And that clarity becomes part of your legacy. You move through the world with a quiet certainty now, not arrogance, not detachment, but an internal knowing that doesn't fluctuate with opinion. You don't need consensus to stand firm. You don't need permission to be aligned. Your confidence is no longer loud, it's stable. You also feel a deeper connection to something greater than yourself. Whether you name it faith, God, calling, or purpose, it no longer feels distant or abstract. It feels present, integrated, alive in your decisions, not just your beliefs. Spirituality becomes embodied. You don't perform it, you live it. You notice how your reactions change. Where you once rushed to respond, you now pause. Where you once assumed offense, you now seek understanding. Where you once carried resentment, you now choose release. Not because you forgot, but because you outgrew. Forgiveness at this stage isn't emotional. It's strategic. You understand that carrying bitterness costs too much. You've worked too hard to rebuild yourself, to let old wounds dictate your future. So you release, not to excuse, but to free. This freedom gives you emotional availability for what actually matters. You invest in fewer relationships, but deeper ones. You value presence over performance. You choose connection over convenience. your life simplifies. And in that simplicity, meaning expands. You also become more honest with yourself about your limits, your capacity, your humanity. You no longer hold yourself to impossible standards. You allow rest without guilt. You allow joy without suspicion. You stop waiting for permission to enjoy the life you're building. That's confirmation too, because nothing aligned requires you to suffer endlessly to be legitimate. Purpose doesn't demand burnout. Calling doesn't require self-erasure. You learn how to hold responsibility without heaviness. You also become aware that your journey has equipped you to speak to others who are still finding their footing. Not from superiority, but from empathy. You recognize their confusion because you lived it. You recognize their fear because you survived it. And when you speak, you don't rush them. You don't shame them. You don't rush resolution. You remind them that becoming takes time. That reminder alone is impact. You stop measuring success by milestones and start measuring it by alignment. Are you honest? Are you present? Are you moving in truth? If yes, you consider the day successful, even if nothing dramatic happened. That's wisdom. You trust now that small, consistent alignment compounds into something meaningful. You don't underestimate the power of showing up steadily. You don't chase viral moments, you build enduring ones. Your legacy becomes less about what you achieve and more about how you live. And that kind of legacy lasts. As this chapter closes, there's a sense of completeness, not finality, but readiness. You're not at the end of the journey. You're at the beginning of a more grounded phase. One where you move forward without fragmentation. You're integrated. Your past no longer competes with your future. Your identity no longer negotiates with fear. Your purpose no longer waits for validation. You walk forward aware, anchored, and awake. And if there's one truth that remains, it's this. You were never late. You were never lost. You were never forgotten. You were being prepared in ways that only make sense now. So as you continue, you do so without rush, without noise, without needing to announce what's unfolding. Because what's real doesn't need to be defended. It simply continues, and so do you.